Imagine compacting the gothic open world of 2004's Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines into an RPG that is far slower and more deliberate in its execution, dousing it with the same variety of linear character-driven storytelling made popular in Telltale's The Walking Dead series, then finally handing it off to receive one last blood injection from the legendary puzzle game Myst. That's the pedigree that Vampire the Masquerade Swansong tries to live up to, but it struggles to piece its own identity as a detective RPG together until the very end. It's rich with decisions that should feel meaningful in theory, but its emotional moments exist in service to a story with no clue what to do with them. And its many obtuse puzzles are often so clumsily explained that you'd be mortally forgiven for walking out of Swansong's dark, hazy alcove before its final embrace. Things kick off as you step into a fancy pair of vampire shoes and head on down to the Camarilla, an upscale vampire court seated in the heart of Boston. It's always a treat when you get to play the clear villain of a story, but wait, you're not the clear villain of this story? Instead, Swansong's villains are a generic group of heavily armed religious fanatics in police uniforms that unironically label themselves as the Second Inquisition. If that wasn't enough to make your eyes roll, it's headed by this guy.
We have come to Boston. Your kind doesn't stand a chance.
And if you don't already have an emotional investment in Vampire the Masquerade's world, Swansong does very little to pull you in. From the first scene, you're barraged with jargon-rich dialogue spoken between characters who already know what's going on, and who already have a history with one another, but don't know you. None of the three playable characters, Leisha, MM, or Caleb, really feels like an in for us, and for a good while, conversations feel like walking into a party where everyone talks to each other, but no one talks to you. All three have their own unique backstory related to where they sit on the Camarilla's hierarchy, and at least they're each decently voice acted, but it's still jarring to be dropped directly into each of their stories at full speed ahead without establishing the stakes of the vampire world that are so quickly threatened by the Second Inquisition. As a result, any emotional connection to be had with the cast of vampires only begins to form in the last quarter of Swansong's 20-hour story. Well, after you've already made most of the decisions that would determine each character's fate. World building is certainly helped along by the lore-rich codex if you take the time to read it, but even after spending significant time gaining an understanding of the vampire underworld, the first few legs of the story are still rather uninspired and uninteresting until you've had sufficient time to shape it around your choices. There's no shortage of supernatural violence in Vampire the Masquerade Swansong, but not in the way you'd normally expect for an RPG. There's no combat here whatsoever, just cutscenes where combat takes place in scripted displays of vampiric fighting prowess. This isn't a death knell by any means, since the best RPGs can get by without the need for constant action. Unfortunately, this is far from the best. Despite the lack of fighting, you still need to sate your character's bestial thirst. But more specifically, you need to maintain their discipline bar, which is like a mana bar that powers vampire abilities. To do this, you have to periodically sneak one of several designated humans into private spaces and suck as much blood as you can without killing them, which is yawn-inducingly simple to do. If you do end up killing a mortal by deliberately drinking from them 2 times, the suspicion gauge shared by each of your 3 characters goes up, which can gradually incur skill penalties until you bring it back down again by collecting loose pieces of intel that your NPC vampire comrades seem to have a knack for leaving around everywhere. It's almost always worth feeding on each human at least once to replenish your discipline, since that's what grants the ability to dominate tense conversations, reveal hidden objects, or even teleport to distant hidden locations depending on who you're playing as. Likewise, as your discipline pool goes down, your hunger goes up, gradually making you less capable during tense encounters.
Are we going to be hungry like this the whole time?
We'll figure something out.
Aside from the times you do get to use your vampire powers, most of your time in Swansong is spent doing the same mundane things that any regular human could have done. You begin each mission with a limited pool of willpower points to spend hacking computers, picking locks, and displaying your flair for rhetoric while discussing the finer points of human blood.
It gives their blood incredible character, a vintage.
This would be fine enough if the skill point system were less punishing, but an unbalanced and unclear skill check system dominates dialogue and confrontations. For instance, in certain cases, a critical conversation can still result in failure even after you've spent enough precious willpower points that they display as having a 100% chance of success in the menu. That's not what 100% means. Fail states don't boot you to a game over screen, but they can cost you experience points that you would have been able to allocate in the following mission. They also tend to change the direction of the overarching story, supposedly making later encounters more challenging. And because willpower restoring items are so few and far between, Swansong can easily slow to a halt if you fail enough interactions, which can happen if you choose to allocate your experience points to the wrong skills before each level. That's a big problem, since you can't change or re-specialize your skills once you find yourself stuck in front of a locked skill check, unless you're willing to restart the level from scratch. Making matters worse, Swansong's maps are so inconsistently designed that it's functionally impossible to know which skills will or won't be useful before you start. It's a crapshoot. It's good that there's always at least one solution to move the story forward that's available to all characters on each map, but the most basic possible solution usually involves solving a puzzle, which might be more trouble than it's worth. Swansong's puzzles vary wildly in their complexity and are often too incoherent due to how inconspicuous their clues tend to be. Many of them give you little to work with and often force you to run around in circles before you finally manage to piece them together. Most of these puzzles require deductive reasoning, which is just fine, but a few of them do get a little too esoteric for their own good. For instance, one puzzle requires you to pay very close attention to the direction a certain mythical king is pointing his arms, but you won't know that without doing some serious guesswork. Likewise, you're expected to pay close attention to long stretches of mind-numbingly dull dialogue to pick up clues, which feels more like a ploy to pad out Swansong's length than anything else.
Attention. She locked herself in the injection room.
Do you know why?
Because she's a fucking junkie. Just like all the vintages.
Vampire the Masquerade Swansong constantly threatens to be a competent detective RPG, and it might have succeeded if not for the fact that it tirelessly gets in its own way. Its premise is interesting, but its heroes and villains are bland, and as a result, the lukewarm story takes far too long to rev up to its maximum potential. By the time you finally become decently invested in its 3 playable characters and their individual quests for survival in the politically charged vampire underworld, Swansong has already reached its finale. It might fare better on a second playthrough, since even its most brutally obtuse puzzles are only difficult to bypass once, and you'll have some idea of which skills you should specialize in on a given level. Then it's all about getting to see those alternative paths that you could have taken the first time around. But it takes such a level of patience to get there in the first place that it might just be too much to ask from any mere mortal. For more, check out our reviews of Ayudin Chronicle Rising and Weird West, and for everything else, stick with IGN.